We're going to open our Bibles now to the 10th chapter of Exodus, Exodus chapter 10, and we're going to focus on the last part of this chapter, the 9th plague, the plague of darkness. And there's not a lot here for us to just to read and to comment on. And the plague itself is fairly simple and straightforward. But I want to suggest to you that the implications of this narrative, as short as it is, reaches throughout the Bible as God uses the concept of darkness to communicate something in His everlasting message in the Bible, both in the Old and even more so in the New Testament. So we're going to start by reading verse 21 to the end of the chapter and make a few comments about that, and then I want us to go ahead and go beyond this context and think about all the connections that there are in the gospel message. Verse 21, Then the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. He's stretching his hand out toward heaven. Why? Where does the light come from? Okay, it comes from the heavens. It comes from the sun, the moon, the stars. And so he's reaching out toward the sun. And of course the sun was worshipped by the Egyptians as the god Ra. And he says the point will be that there will be no light from their God, from the God of Egypt, from the god Ra. There will be darkness over the land. He says a darkness to be felt. Okay, so Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the people of Israel had light where they lived. Then Pharaoh called Moses and said, Go, serve the Lord, or serve Jehovah. Your little ones also may go with you. Only let your flocks and your herds remain behind. But Moses said, You must also let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Our livestock also must go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind. For we must take of them to serve the Lord our God, and we do not know with what we must serve the Lord until we arrive there. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him, Get away from me. Take care never to see my face again. For on the day you see my face, you shall die. Moses said, As you say, I will not see your face again. Okay, who was in greater danger here? Moses or Pharaoh? Pharaoh. And how could he not see that? Because he was blind. He was blind by his rage, by his pride. He was blind by all of the passion of the flesh that would keep him from seeing beyond the end of his nose, to seeing backwards at 8 plagues already passed. The plagues had passed, and one plague after another had affirmed a reality about this Jehovah God. He is Lord of all the powers. Now, the powers that they've seen so far have been the powers of familiar close at hand, nature. The locusts, okay, that was pretty close at hand. You had the frogs, and you had the lice, and you had the scarab of the dung beetles, you know. You had even hail that would hit you pretty close. You had the skies and the clouds that would produce the hail. But now, what about the sun? Where's the sun? It's not close. You can't imagine the distance. He couldn't. I'm sure he couldn't imagine. I don't know how good their mathematicians were. They were pretty good. They built their pyramids with some amazing mathematical knowledge about the position of the sun and the moon and the stars, and they oriented their pyramids according to their knowledge of astrology and these of distant bodies of light. But nevertheless, what we're looking at here, he said that there may be a darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. Okay? Nighttime in Birmingham. Gets dark here, doesn't it?
Out in the country.
Out in the country. It's not that dark in Birmingham, is it? We've got lights burning everywhere. Even in the country, you can, on a good moonlit night, you can see somewhat. You have stars. Even when there's a moonless night, it's just never really completely dark, is it? What does it take to be this dark? A darkness that can be felt where you cannot see anything or anybody.
I've experienced, I think others probably have, we've done a lot of cave tours.
Okay.
And you go down and they make you get close to the walls and stuff, then they turn off the lights, and then once your eyes have adjusted and they let it go for a minute or so, it really does have that sense of being felt that a person can be standing right beside you and you don't see a thing. There's absolutely nothing.
Let's try to think about the physical relationship that they have right now, the physical relationship to light. How did God do this? Exactly, physically. How did God make it to where there was no light during the daytime? I mean, you can have a solar eclipse and it's not like this.
Well, and also the Israelites had light where they lived.
And the Israelites had light where they were. How did the light where Israel was not get into where the Egyptians were? Think about it now. Goshen is in Egypt. And if you consider the Israelites are a great big light bulb. How come the light in Israel is not in the rest of Egypt?
Because God is better at physics than...
There's no natural explanation for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he said it, so whatever he says is going to be.
Yeah. The question is, can God do a thing like that? Yes.
So, Terry, that's where a lot of people who they're trying to minimize the miracles, they go through and they always try to find those natural explanations. And a lot of times God does use natural things to work his plan. Like he uses the wind to draw back the Jordan River, that kind of thing. Or the locust, he could have been preparing the locust for decades for that one moment.
Right.
But there's plenty of examples where he just breaks all the rules, like the sundial going backwards and the sun standing still.
And there's no natural way to explain it.
That's right.
That's the thing. This was a supernatural event. You think about light. And light's always traveling all over the universe from every direction. How do you not have light? Well, God supernaturally put a barrier that light could not penetrate. And so, we know what light is energy, and it passes through the air at the speed of light, right? And the Lord stopped all energy vibration from light in that region of Egypt. And they experienced 3 days of light, of no light, absolutely no light. It was darkness. Now, that becomes a very important reality that God uses to communicate things about Himself and about us in the future, because we read in the New Testament about an outer darkness, a darkness of punishment, no light, a darkness, and also there is fire. How do you have fire and darkness? Absolute darkness and fire. Can you have that? Not in our natural world, but in God's world. And can God create fire without light? Yes, He can. And we have an example of that right here. And that's why when we start trying to imagine or speculate, well, that can't be true because it just doesn't fit. You can't have a lake of fire and have outer darkness in the same place. You can. You did right here. You have the sun shining brightly on Egypt. And I have an idea Egypt was just as hot, don't you think? This is the desert, Sahara Desert. And even in the wintertime, it's fairly hot there, I believe. You're not very far from the equator. So this is hot, and it's dry, and yet there's no light from the sun. Now, this was the divine signature. That is, Goshen had light, and Egypt did not. And so Pharaoh comes back to Moses, and he has a message for him, and he says, you can go, but not your livestock. Okay? As if he's in a position to bargain with God. He has no bargaining power with God. And yet he's not willing to accept that. He's not willing to accept. It's just like people who come to God with the gospel. The gospel calls men. Man has destroyed his life in sin, and he comes to God, but he comes to God conditionally. And the gospel does not offer salvation to men that come to God conditionally. Lord, I'll be your servant. Only I've got to hang on to what? Whatever it is you think that you've got to have. Because the gospel requires what? He says, he that would save his life shall lose it. He that will lose his life for my sake shall find it. All of the language of denying yourself, taking up your cross and following me, these are prerequisites. That was a part of the repentance of the gospel message. We cannot bargain with God. We stand before God with no bargaining power. God has all the power. And we are the ones who are in debt to God. We are the sinners. We are the ones who have nothing to bring. That song is accurate, that says, I come to you with nothing. I have nothing to bargain with God for. I throw myself at the mercy of God as a beggar pleading for forgiveness. And you'll notice this time, Pharaoh is not even with the locust plague. He just got through saying, I have sinned against Jehovah. I have sinned against you, Moses. Please forgive me and take away this plague. He just got through saying that. And then he turned around and he didn't. He didn't let them go. He's done that twice now. I think maybe he's figured out that he can't fake anything. He can't fake contrition. He can't fake a plea for forgiveness. At this point, he says, I'll let you go. But at this point, the pride kicks in big time. Moses says, not a hoof. I like that, don't you? Not a hoof is going to stay behind. There's no bargaining here. It is unconditional surrender. No terms. Unconditional. Pharaoh, you must unconditionally surrender to Jehovah God and do what he said and let us go. And so he's in a rage. He has been challenged by this messenger, this shepherd of Jehovah God. And in a rage, he says, get away from me. Take care never to see my face again. For on the day you see my face, you shall die. I'd like, before we get into some of the application of this in the Bible, I want to go all the way to 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4. 2 Peter chapter 2, and let me begin. Let's see. I'm going to have to begin, I guess, in verse 1. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction, and many will follow their sensuality. Because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. Okay, he's not through the sentence there, I know. Let's go ahead and keep reading. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. If by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. And if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. For as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Then, all right, here's the conclusion. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. His message is what? He kept the angels who disobeyed God in a place of gloomy darkness. Now that phrase, gloomy darkness, from the times of Exodus 10 until 2 Peter, occurs over and over and over again. Gloomy darkness. The gloomy darkness implies the wrath of God. It implies the suffering of eternal punishment from the hand of God in a place of gloomy darkness. Let's go back to the beginning. Genesis chapter 1. How was the earth in the very beginning? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. So how was the earth? It was dark. How dark was it? Can you imagine?
There was no light.
There was no light. So, it's like what Rhodes is talking about in the cave, right? No light. You reach out, try to touch somebody, you feel like you're touching the darkness. Okay? That was the earth. That was God, was it not? God in all of His existence at that point, it was all dark until God said, verse 3, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. There was evening, and there was morning the first day. Okay, John chapter 1. In the beginning, how does it start? Was the Word. Okay. John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him. Without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. What's John talking about? I know we've had this discussion before, haven't we? We've talked about that.
Light is a symbol for righteousness.
Okay. John, Jesus in the writings of John now is expressing light as being a metaphor for righteous behavior. And life is a description of that righteous behavior of God, because that righteous behavior becomes the light of the world. So we're going to have a double use of the word light and a double use of the word darkness. Okay? Because darkness is a place where there is no light. As there was here in Egypt, it was dark for 3 days that you could touch, because there was no light there. Now, Deuteronomy 4. Deuteronomy 4, Moses in his farewell sermon reminds them about their beginnings as they leave Egypt and as they become acquainted with God. And he says in chapter 4 and verse 11, he says, let's see, and you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. Okay, you see that word gloom and that word darkness? Explain that to me now. The mountain is on fire, it burned with fire to the heart of heaven. Okay, try to picture now what he wants us to see. This column of fire, or this mountain on fire, as they looked at it, how big was that fire? Apparently it was as far as the eye could see. Okay, it went up to the heart of heaven. Now, if I've got that right, if I've got that translated right, I'm looking at a huge column of fire coming from a mountain. This was no volcano. This was God manifesting His great glory. But then it says it is wrapped in darkness. Can you picture that? Fire wrapped in darkness, And he says, cloud and gloom. Now, that language is foreboding, don't you think? He's wanting us to understand. God's communicating something here. He communicated something in the 9th plague. God declared no light in Egypt 3 days, and there was no light. And people could not even get out of their bed. They couldn't go anywhere. They just stood right where they were. 3 days. Could you imagine the eternity of that? Now we're looking at God who can do that. And that darkness manifests itself. Chapter 5 and 23 again. He comes back to the thought. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 23. As soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders, and you said, behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still live. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of God, of the Lord our God anymore, we shall die. For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God, speaking out of the midst of the fire, as we have, and has still lived? Go near, hear all the Lord our God will say. Speak to us, all the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear and do it. They didn't want to see that again. They didn't want to be that close to that great danger that was the fire and the darkness and the gloom, the cloud and the gloom. They did not want to be near that again. Joshua talks about it. Joshua 24. 40 years later now, after they have taken the land of promise and they're settling in, Joshua is warning them not to forget that image of God. Don't forget it, he's saying. He gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, verse 1, and summoned the elders and the heads and the judges and the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond Euphrates. Your fathers lived, okay, they served other gods. Let's see, I need to go down and where's the verse I'm looking for? I don't want to read the whole chapter. I've written the verse down wrong. Well, that happens every now and then.
Yes, it does.
It's my computer's fault. I'll take it.
The darkness in verse 7.
Verse 7, could it be?
Darkness between
Okay,
the
yes.
Egyptians.
And when they cried to the Lord, he put darkness. Yes, I know that was one of the points. He put darkness, okay, between you and the Egyptians. Yeah, my 2. I guess I wrote it down with my hand, and my 2 looked like a 7, or my 7 looked like a 2. He put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and made the sea come upon them and cover them, and your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. The Egyptians saw darkness again. What happened here? All right, the column of God, the column of fire that was over and leading Israel as they were crossing the Red Sea, came back when the army of Egypt approached, and came down between the army of the Egyptians and the Israelites. And when it came down, it was darkness. Again, think about the darkness that was the 3 days of the plague. It was a darkness so thick, it was so dark, that they did not want to move. It paralyzed them. It's like they stayed in bed for 3 days. All night long, here are the horses and the chariots and the soldiers eager to go and chase the Israelites, but they're afraid to move. They're caught in the great darkness of God that was so dark it could be felt. 2 Samuel 22, verse 10, and Psalm 18 and 9. I'm just going to look at this, the three places this description of God is given again. 2 Samuel chapter 22. It is poetic. It is like a psalm. Verse 10. Verse 9, smoke went up from his nostrils, devouring fire from his mouth, glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. Okay, this is God riding on a cloud, riding on an angel, a cherubim, or cherub. But thick darkness was under his feet. Again, Psalm 18 and verse 9. Let's see, verse 29 of this chapter. He says, for you are my lamp, O Lord, my God, lightens my darkness. Okay, here you have the double use of the word darkness.
He also mentions in 12 the darkness around him like a canopy.
Yes, there it is again. He made darkness around him his canopy, thick clouds, a gathering of water. So here we have the language starting right here in Exodus and then renewed at here in David's poem, and then again in Psalm 18 verse 9, then Psalm 97 verse 2, the same language. Okay, God has this great darkness around him, but God dwells in light. Psalm 139 verse 11 and 12. Daniel 2, 19 through 23. Several verses talking about in God there is no darkness at all. Micah 7 and verse 8. With God there is no darkness. But there is darkness. So, how do we harmonize that language? Some of the poetry says there is this thick darkness around God, as Israel saw with their eyes. That was literally true. They saw with their eyes a column of fire and also a thick cloud of darkness wrapped around him. That's what he showed them. But then, in the same inspired word, there is no darkness in him. In what sense is there no darkness in him? Yes?
He's holy and righteous.
Okay. I think he's talking about God's light as his righteousness, as his truth, as his faithfulness. That becomes the metaphor of the enlightenment, God's truth. Yes?
What about the darkness? Can that be his wrath? Can that be his judgment?
I think that's the idea, yes. We're going to see this more and more. The darkness is a way of describing the anger of God, the darkness of God, the power of God to punish.
It's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of an angry God.
Yes.
So
It's a terrible thing to fall in the hands of...
terror.
Right. So, these are both characteristics of our God, that we are being presented here in the plague of the darkness, and as the Israelites are leaving the land of Egyptian bondage, and God places his darkness between them and the army of the Egyptians. Darkness was synonymous with calamity. That was my next point. It is, by extension, punishment. Okay? First, you have it described as, well, look at the book of Job. It's poetic. It's a great book. And look in your concordance, and the word darkness occurs over and over and over again. What's Job talking about? the darkness of his sorrow, the darkness of his suffering, the darkness of not knowing why. He didn't know. And so living, he's talking about suffering in darkness. Not because he'd done anything wrong. It's just he's describing how it is to suffer in darkness. Jeremiah chapter 2. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 6. He said, "They did not say, 'Where is the Lord, who brought us up from the land of Egypt, who led us in the wilderness, in a land of deserts and pits, in a land of drought and deep darkness, in a land that none passes through, where no man dwells.'" So it was a land of drought and deep darkness. So he's communicating what? It's a land of hardship, land of difficulty. Verse 31 then, he says, "And you, O generation, behold the word of the Lord. Have I been a wilderness to Israel, or a land of thick darkness?" Okay. What's God saying? Did I treat you in this way? Did I treat you as someone who withholds good things? Am I the one who afflicts you? He's describing the way that he cared for them. "Why then do my people say, 'We are free, we will come no more to you'?" The Israelites in Jeremiah's day were complaining about how God was taking care of them.
That sounds like Malachi.
I'm sorry?
That sounds like Malachi.
Yes, it does. Right.
Because,
They were, in Malachi, they were complaining about everything, weren't they? And that also causes us to not serve God with all of our heart. That's what was happening there. Proverbs 20 and verse 20 now. We're looking at the way in which the Bible uses darkness to describe not just calamity, but also the consequences of walking in darkness. You walk in darkness, there is darkness that comes with you. All right, verse 20. "If one curses his father or his mother, his lamp will be put out in utter darkness." Now, there you have the phrase utter darkness. Okay? That's used in the New Testament. In Matthew 3 time, we'll see in just a minute. The unprofitable servant is cast into outer darkness, trying to describe extremes of darkness. And that's what this one is saying. This proverb is saying. In other words, someone who curses his father or mother is cursed of God. His lamp will be put out. Okay? You get the poetry that, yes, Lucy?
Jesus talks about hell as a gnashing of teeth and, darkness.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's horrifying, I guess.
Okay.
It's
And this is, I think, what we need to capture that idea. Okay, I know it's not fashionable today to talk about these things, but this is Bible stuff. This is God trying to reach us, trying to teach us something good, the fear of God. It was when they forgot about these things that they began to become carnal and worldly and rebellious against God. Isaiah 47 verse 5. I'm going to have to hurry through this because I'm already running out of time. Isaiah 47 and verse 5. He says, "Sit in silence. Go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called the mistress of the kingdoms." Go into darkness. Sit in silence. Go into darkness. Jeremiah 13 and 16. says, give glory to Jehovah God before He brings darkness before your feet, before your feet stumble into gloom and deep darkness. That's a threat, okay? Just like you have in the New Testament, it's a threat. If we don't give glory to Jehovah God, then He will bring darkness. When did He bring darkness before? In the plague. And there in Exodus chapter 10.
Sometimes when he uses this word darkness, so isn't he talking about death or the end of life?
Yes, yeah, I'm getting to that. You're right. That's going to be
Ecclesiastes, I think.
yeah, Ecclesiastes. That's right. I've got it written down here somewhere. Okay. Joel 2:2, Amos 5 and verse 8. The day of Jehovah shall be darkness and not light. And Zephaniah 1 and 15, the darkest of all of the prophets condemning Israel for their sin. A day of wrath, he says, will be a day of anguish and darkness and gloom. Now, before I leave this thought, darkness is also described, or is a way of describing ignorance, or walking in sin, or living a life of lies and deception, where all things are false and you stumble in the dark. Isaiah 5 and verse 20. You find this way of using darkness, especially in Isaiah throughout the book. But Isaiah 5 and 20, and also the prophecies about the blind being given light, as Jesus quotes. Okay, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. I think that's fairly easy to understand there. Good for evil, evil for good, darkness for light, light for darkness. In that case, the darkness is moral. It is lies and distortions. So, skip over to chapter 8 and verse 19. One of my favorite chapters. I love this one. Because he's making fun of the mediums, the witch doctors and such, that people would go to inquire of God. In verse 19, he says, verse 16, bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will hope in him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel for the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. Now verse 19. And when you say, or when they say to you, inquire of the mediums and the necromancers who chirp and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living? To the teaching and to the testimony, if they will not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. Okay? When does the dawn come? After the night. Okay? If it stays nighttime, if it never dawns, it stays dark. Okay? Then he says, they will pass through the land greatly distressed and hungry, and when they are hungry they will be enraged and will speak contemptuously against their king and their God, and turn their faces upward, and they will look to the earth, but behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. Does that sound familiar? There again, thick darkness and gloom. That is a punishment for refusing the light that God provides. Isaiah 9 and 2, Isaiah 29:19, Isaiah 42 and 6, Isaiah 42 is almost the whole chapter. The Lord is saying, the blind will see. It was a prophecy. He was going to send His Son, the servant, who would cause the blind to see. And in John 9, Jesus heals a blind man. And the whole narrative that unfolds there with the blind man is what? You had all these supposedly sighted people who would not accept what He had to say. Jesus had healed him of his blindness. They would not believe. So at the end, who's the blind man? The Pharisees, yes.
You know, that time in John's ministry when he was doubting Jesus, and he sent his disciples, and they said, "Are you the Christ, or are we looking for another one?" He was having second thoughts.
Yes.
And Jesus says, "Go tell them what you see. The blind have their eyes open."
Yes.
It's that same thing.
That's right. And that would be a fulfillment of Isaiah. That was a way of authenticating the work of Jesus as the Messiah. The blind shall see. And it was always a double. It was the double use of the blindness. From God's point of view, what's more important, the physical blindness or the spiritual blindness? The devastation to men is that they have eyes and they will not see. That's Jesus in Matthew 13. They have ears and they will not hear. In Matthew 6 and 23, he talks about if a man if his eye is evil, okay, then his body is dark. Okay? If your eye is evil, he's talking about the eye of covetousness, okay? Then how great is the darkness that fills your whole body. And Luke 11 returns to that very same theme. And of course, the book of John is full of that terminology. The idea of the light of God opening the eyes of the blind. And it becomes then the idea of repentance is you cast off the works of darkness, because sin is darkness. 2 Corinthians 6 and 14, do not have fellowship with darkness. What fellowship does light have with darkness? Ephesians 5 and 11, rather reprove them, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Okay, well, my time is gone. I think we've touched pretty much all the points that I wanted to touch.
Terry, I was thinking, I know the imagery is accommodated, but in that Psalm 18 passage you read, it mentions the darkness under his foot. You think about the judgment of God, yes. You're under his foot.
coming down real hard on us. Yeah. Well, let's see. We're waiting for an invitation song to be announced. Is Titus not back yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
I'm sure he'll be here just now.
Okay. Since I've got a minute or two, let's go to Matthew 8:13. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 13. That's not the one. I did it again, didn't I? Verse 12. He says, verse 11, I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion Jesus said, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. So he's describing the Israelites being cast into outer darkness because they were not receptive to the message of Jesus. Chapter 22 and 13. Another parable of Jesus. This one is the parable of the wedding feast. Okay, and you have the man who did not have on the wedding garment. And then verse 13, then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. The Lord, I think, realizes just how much we hate darkness. When we're children, do your kids have night lights in their room? Or have you gotten over that? Nah, you haven't yet. You can ask my children, they still have night lights. They still have night lights in their room. I know you need to have the lights turned out. You can sleep better. But it's just a little bit frightening to have all of the lights out in the house. Maybe you can put a timer on it so it can turn off later after you're asleep. The fact is, the Lord offers us light in heaven. All of the message is that Jesus is the light in the book of Revelation. In the land of paradise, there will never be any darkness. Now, I don't know if that's poetic or figurative or if that's literally true, I suspect. I don't know. But the Lord wants us to imagine paradise as a place where the lights never go out, where the trees bear fruit every month, 12 months out of the year. I like that idea, don't you? A land in which God is the light. Jesus Christ is the light. It's a land that we have to hope for, because when we walk on this earth, we're always going to be facing darkness of one kind or another. We're going to have to be tempted by the flesh to do the works of the flesh that are also called the works of darkness. And that's what they are. That's how God wants us to see sin and carnality and the works of the flesh of Galatians 5 and 19. The warring and the arguments that Sam was talking about a while ago that cause people to fight and then sue one another and try to get one another put in jail or pull a gun and shoot one another. Those are all works of darkness. But in heaven, there's no night there. There's no works of darkness there. It's a place to long for and a place to want to be. If you're not serving God, now's the time to start, don't you think? Let's stand together and sing.